Hi again, another Pride and Prejudice video, focusing on a much later point in the novel. So this passage comes from chapter 43, which is obviously late in the book, and is a really significant turning point in the main narrative of Elizabeth's relationship with Darcy. It follows the potential climax of some of the other conflicts that have arisen and that he's sort of resolved and sorted out for them. And it marks her sort of seeing this character in a completely new light, encouraging us as readers to see him in a new light. And the main method that's worth talking about in much of this is the use of setting as a means of characterization. So um, Darcy has been seen as a character in several moments earlier in the novel, but in different locations, as a guest, as an intruder, as this very sort of prejudiced and awkward character. But here, he is immediately transformed by the description of his property, Pemberley, and the woods around it. Elizabeth is approaching it with perturbation. She's disturbed, nervous, having previously really disliked him and rejected his awkward, unwanted proposal. So we see her really conforming to a sort of 19th century female stereotype with her nerves and her spirits in a high flutter, almost becoming the kind of nervous female trope that her mother fulfills. And as you get the park of Pemberley described to you, all of the adjectives, the sort of modification and description, becomes symbolic. Large, variety, beautiful, wide, all sort of very positive and building up an image of the property and therefore Darcy as something big, significant, important, interesting, worthwhile. More conformity from Elizabeth. Her mind was too full for conversation, poor woman. But she saw and admired every remarkable spot and point of view. And, amongst them is particularly the hill, described as a considerable eminence. An eminence can just mean a sort of high point, a rise from the ground, but it's also often used to describe a sort of distinguished, important character or person. It was a large, handsome stone building standing well on rising ground and backed by a ridge of high, woody hills. So height, beauty often emphasised, and possibly, a more radical feminist reading, we could even look at the building and the hill as a phallic symbol, this big rising image of masculine power that she's suddenly very fixated on. There are details, though, that maybe take it away from just sort of size, girth. Its banks were neither formal nor falsely adorned. Elizabeth was delighted. So we're starting to see a sort of sensitivity or beauty in the character of Darcy that she is interested in. And this use that I mentioned in the other video of a free and direct narration where it slips from the third person into her in her thoughts allows the focalizer Elizabeth to share. At that moment, she felt that to be the mistress of Pemberley might be something. So that's a really significant turning point. The exclamation helps us to see that as she sort of begins to realise that this could have been her property. Now, that does invite an interpretation of Elizabeth as what we might, in modern terms, call a bit of a gold digger, because it sort of leads us to question whether her interest in him is purely transactional. But then when we look at it within the context that we've seen of the marriage market and this limited female experience, it's not really like she has a lot of options. And so is Austen inviting us to see how materialistic and transactional marriage can be, that the novel shows it as a career option for women, but as the only career option. This kind of positive portrayal of Darcy's character continues not just through setting but through minor characters. So the respectfully looking elderly woman, much less fine and more civil than she had any notion of finding her. Each detail allows Elizabeth's expectations to be thwarted and surprised. So as we have Darcy built up as a character through this setting and the minor characters, we also have Elizabeth being knocked down. Her pomposity is being demolished. Her earlier confidence and intellect is being questioned really by her position in this chapter. So that overall debate of how much she and her rebellion is celebrated hangs on how we find her in this passage. Again, the room, it was a large, well-proportioned room, handsomely fitted up. Now, handsome was a much more flexible adjective at the time, but still it hints to us, doesn't it, that the masculinity of the building and the rooms, and the idea that their attractiveness is synonymous with Darcy's attractiveness. The hill crowned with wood, all of these details become sort of symbols of his power and attractiveness. Perhaps rather than looking at it in this more phallocentric or materialistic way, we can also look at her admiration of his taste, which is maybe a more intellectual than material attraction. So rather than Elizabeth just being impressed by how wealthy this man is it more that she's impressed by that he isn't the sort of douchebag that she initially thought he was? And of this place I might have been mistress. So we get this quite big chunk of not dialogue but inner thoughts presented as dialogue, where she really openly admits to herself what could have been and how she could be as the mistress of this. She comforts herself with the idea that her aunt and uncle would have been lost to her because she thinks this man is such a snob, and says that this was a lucky recollection. It saved her from something very like regret. I think perhaps we're invited to laugh at that. We, as a reader, infer very strongly that she is experiencing regret, and we share her distrust, but we feel the genre of romantic comedy making a union between the two start to feel inevitable. Having rejected him early in the novel, are we now expecting Elizabeth's turnaround and her attraction to him? You get some discussion of Wickham, who of course is the sort of fly in the ointment. He's the antagonist that she initially led her to dislike and think he was a problematic character. And we get this perspective. I'm afraid he has turned out very wild. So partly we're about to get Wickham's character explained and find out how innocent and sort of wholesome Darcy is by comparison, but also it's the contrast between the two men that often allows the characterization to be positive. I'm not looking at him so much in this passage, but it is worth considering Wickham's character as an alternative masculinity in the novel. He's presented as a villain, an enemy, but really he is conforming to a lot of masculine stereotypes and ideas. So does his character constitute some criticism of masculinity? And also his relationship with Lydia is worth looking at, because both characters are perhaps the most transgressive, rebellious figures in the novel, but they are distinctly punished for it. And so there's lots of debate you can have around them. Again, the characterization of Darcy continues with minor female characters. So it's the sister who is described as accomplished. She plays and sings all day in the next room, and a new instrument just come down for her, a present from her master, Darcy. So like the servant, the sister is just used as a little symbol to characterize a man. So is Austen giving in again to sort of sexist tropes in literature by using women as minor figures that help to decorate men, but also the characterization of the sister. She's accomplished, but what is meant by accomplished for a woman is, well, she can play an instrument. And so it's that limited female experience. Whether or not Austen is deliberately pointing that out or simply reflecting the norms of her time is another question. And what it sets Darcy up as is as a guardian, an ideal patriarch, a paternalistic figure, and we start to see that that's the kind of husband he would be. He's powerful, he's attractive, he's got all this taste, etc., etc., but he would look after Elizabeth and sort of control her potentially. Then we get a more sort of Georgina's video has mentioned the Bechdel test. The conversation immediately turns to marriage. If your master would marry you, we might see more of him. I think that's Elizabeth's aunt pointing that out to the servant. And so this discussion of, he might not marry anyone because no one will be good enough. Elizabeth has previously been proposed to him, and so as his value is sort of presented as increasing, her decision is questioned and undermined. So what we might have seen as this positive female rebellion earlier in the novel is now being questioned as something silly, unwise, foolish. So Austen is deliberately building up the value and attractiveness of his character. And there's a sort of little conclusion to that at the end of this passage from chapter 43. You get the more evaluative thoughts from Elizabeth. Notice thought, not said, don't call it dialogue. And what an amiable light does this place in. So the focalizer, the protagonist, gives us an evaluation that we're supposed to agree with, and then her aunt agrees. This fine account of him. She perhaps fills a similar role to Mrs. Bennet, less neurotic and comedic, but she is very conventional. She sees him as attractive in a very conventional way, points out it's not quite consistent with his behaviour to our poor friend. Perhaps we might be deceived. That's not very likely. Our authority was too good. Perhaps Austen invites us to sneer and giggle at that authority. A lot of the problems of this plot come down to judging people on preconceptions and on limited information. So the authority on which they have previously judged him is called into question. So are we laughing at the pride and prejudice of the protagonist, Elizabeth, and her sort of allies? Does this scene mark the beginning of a feminist protagonist being tamed? Is Austen punishing her for her earlier rebellion? Is it about kind of maturity versus rebellion? Does the novel almost suggest that young women are able to rebel and play at being independent and not conforming, but then ultimately have to give in, marry? So you have Elizabeth, you have Lydia, you have her friend Charlotte, all of these sort of characters who potentially step away from the traditional female role, but end up in safe patriarchal marriages by the end. There is some room for debate on the marriage. Elizabeth and Darcy, is it potentially a marriage of equals because she has rejected him before? She is clearly this intelligent, sort of witty character. They're not social equals. He's far, far wealthier, but the narrative that they go through to reach the conclusion, does it mean that marriage is presented as more of an alliance and something that's got some equality and some independence to it, rather than the conventional box of marriage that Mrs. Bennet has with Mr. Bennet? So just a couple of passages that hopefully will be useful to you if you're doing Pride and Prejudice for your coursework. Make sure you don't fully rely on those three, but certainly use them as a starting point, and maybe pick two more that you would look at in as much detail as this, and that could perhaps be the bulk of your evidence for your essay. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.